You're seeing universities, for instance, begin to implement policies of not having research or educational exchange with Chinese universities. Cultural exchanges are still okay, but almost any kind of meaningful engagement with China is also in the Canadian context, as in the US context over the last few years, become more and more a question.
How has Chinese migration shaped Canada and the US?
The connection to Asia and to China is primarily at first about goods, bringing laborers in to build the railroads in the United States, transcontinental railroads. Same thing happens in Canada, that Chinese coming by boats, ships, and landing in the major ports like Vancouver, San Francisco, and Seattle. That's why the Chinese are here. They're here to build railroads, but also serve as the labor for a lot of the industries that develop. And so that's what brings Chinese in the 19th century. They do a lot of building small businesses and bigger businesses. And so they bring a lot of economic prosperity, which leads to a lot of resentment and the scapegoating of Chinese. And so the politics of scapegoating that really arise in places like California, Oregon, Washington State in the late 19th or 20th century is something that also marks the rise of British Columbia as the westernmost colony and then province of Canada. And so that long history of scapegoating Chinese, it's something that is like a tool in a toolbox that can be kind of pulled out when you need to blame something on someone else. And so anti-Chinese and then what became anti-Asian politics shaped the West Coast of both the United States and Canada. And you could say for both countries, this became a defining way to understand how the country organized around white supremacy. Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, they're all actually kind of white settler colonies, to use a fancy phrase, but they are all places that European migrations, people arrived and they used, certain political tools in similar ways and learned from each other. The kinds of ways in which Chinese were targeted legally. There's people actually read up and researched and said, oh, that this is a good idea that they are doing in Australia. Maybe we should think about it here. And so that kind of sharing of best practices in white supremacy, sharing of policies towards China when China seemed to be a problem or an enemy. We, like the United States, were exclusive. We kept Chinese out. In the United States, the 1882 Exclusion Act, we had a head tax from 1885 to 1923. And then in 1923, we passed an Exclusion Act. So between 1923 and 1947, less than 100 Chinese were allowed in to Canada. Chinese could not vote here until 1947. If you were Chinese, it didn't matter if you were born here, you could not vote. If you've disenfranchised a set of people, you can target them with impunity. And so the big change was family unification here in the 1940s and 50s, just like in the United States. And then in 1967, we removed white supremacy from immigration policy. And so we had large numbers of non-whites come to Canada in the 1970s, and it remade a country that really had been built around white supremacy. And so there are parallels to the United States with 1965 immigration reform, allowing a lot more Asian American communities to form or reform, in the case of Chinese, both north and south of the border in North America.
What is unique about Hong Kong migration to Vancouver?
In the 1990s, there was a large number of Hong Kong Chinese who, knowing that there was going to be a reversion of political control from Britain to the People's Republic of China, many began to come in, not even large numbers, but significant enough numbers. And they came with enough money. They weren't rich. They often were middling people in Hong Kong, but they came with enough money to actually move into neighborhoods that for a long time Chinese weren't really supposed to live in. And that's where the reaction within the press was to focus on these invasive Hong Kong Chinese who were wealthy and rich, and somehow it was inappropriate that they were moving into these neighborhoods that had actually been built around white supremacy, that had housing covenants. And similar to the United States, if you bought a house in this area, there in the contracts that you couldn't sell to non-whites, you couldn't sell to Chinese, or you couldn't sell to indigenous people or Jews. So it was anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Asian sentiments, all wrapped into a legal contract on your house sale. And so that's very similar to what happens on the west coast of the United States at the same time. For Canada, the 1990s moment is kind of unique because we're one of the destinations, along with Australia, New Zealand, London, for many of the Hong Kong Chinese who are seeking basically a place to be. And so that's when Vancouver became world famous. And so you start to read headlines across the world, around the world, with this Vancouver, this phrase coined as like, oh my gosh, it's terrible. We've been transformed by all these Chinese who do inappropriate things like spend money that they've made somewhere else to buy property. And so the scapegoating of Chinese for unaffordable housing or for stores suddenly catering to them and no longer catering to the white customers who only speak English, signage laws began to be passed that you had to have English language signage. So that kind of racism and scapegoating, it's tied to that 1990s moment of and the name Vancouver. So Canada is not some paradise. We've had a long history of anti-Asian racism and exclusion, and our ability to use that as a tool of scapegoating and of really getting people angry and blaming a set of people for broader problems. That's a history that we have had in Canada. There's a bit more of awareness of different kinds of migrations at different times. And so the Hong Kong Chinese coming in the 1990s in large numbers had a huge impact. You say there's an awareness that Hong Kong Chinese also brought a lot of culture and good dim sum. We also brought over some of the best chefs because of our point system. Those were professionals. There's a lot of things that were shaped by moments of migrations.
What are some recent challenges that Chinese immigrants face in Canada?
I'd say one of the things that is probably important to know, but is not something that a lot of people hear about outside of Canada, is that we had a violent flaring of anti-Chinese racist attacks. That was something that occurred here in parallel with what was occurring down in the United States. There's a high awareness that in the United States, racism and racist incidents happen. It's not like racism is off the table as an explanatory mechanism for going, wow, this happened. In Canada was this need to first convince people it happened. 2020, what you saw was a lot of shock from people who thought, this doesn't happen here. I would be asked a lot, are you surprised that this has happened? And I would say, no, I'm not surprised. And that was surprising to a lot of people. If you're thinking about Canada and really the last 2 or 3 years when a recognition that China as a society might be a problem or a threat to national security in the United States or in Canada, there has been a fairly organized reaction by the intelligence agencies of what we refer to as the Five Eyes here. So Canada, Britain, United States, New Zealand, Australia, they share intelligence about the threat of China, for instance. And so what you're seeing is a recurrence, and I would say that this is very worrisome from a historian's point of view, a recurrence of a lot of the things that occurred in the 1950s with the sort of China scare and anti-communism. You're seeing universities, for instance, begin to implement policies of not having research or educational exchange with Chinese universities. Cultural exchanges are still okay, but almost any kind of meaningful engagement with China is also in the Canadian context, as in the US context over the last few years, become more and more a question. And so I think that's one of the most worrisome trends that's occurring both north and south of the border. And it's not an accident that it's occurring both north and south, because in some sense it's being organized by the same sets of people who believe that China will be the threat. The spillover onto someone like me. I am fourth generation. My great grandfather came here, my grandfather came here, but that doesn't mean I'm protected, as are most Chinese American, Chinese Canadian, and Asian American and Asian Canadian populations, from being tied to a change in global politics. And so if China is the enemy, then anyone who could be thought of as somehow tied to China by the way you look, by the way you speak, by where you've come from, even where your great grandparents came from. That I think is a pretty worrisome trend that really requires people coming together and acting. And I think in the Canadian context, what that's led to is a lot of coalitions to push back against anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism. But many of those people within those coalitions are those who experienced Islamophobia. It's others who have been targeted and understand what it's like. Japanese Canadians, just as with Japanese Americans in the United States, were very quick to see how scapegoating that had occurred to their own communities historically, how that is starting to recur. The other thing that, for me, thinking about the present moment, is it really is important to understand the historical context of the use of anti-Chinese politics, both in Canada and the United States, how they were done often historically in concert, sharing best techniques, but also the resistance to it. Chinese communities in the United States and in Canada also shared and talked about how they were hiring lawyers to challenge racist legislation, both north and south of the border, that they were aligning and forming alliances with others who understood what racism was like. I would also say there's some good things. When Canada opened up to China and recognized the People's Republic of China, and there was ping pong diplomacy and opening up, and actually that happened in Canada first. The folks who actually pioneered ping pong diplomacy, and then eventually President Nixon went and recognized China. That had occurred the year before in Canada, and it was our Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau who visited China and watched ping pong matches, and we sent ping pong teams. And so culture exchange as a tool to actually build relations is something that was actually pioneered, you could say, in the early 70s by Canadian diplomats and their advisors. And so I think if there is a moment of optimism in this moment of really rising tension diplomatically and in terms of national contests between the United States and China, between Canada and China, it is that there have always been people who see that this is not actually a fruitful path, and how can we actually work together to prevent things from getting worse, or at least mitigate the worst excesses.